December 9, 1944. Somewhere in northeastern France. The Third Army's morning briefing is already running. Maps on every wall. Officers standing in a room that smells of cold air and cigarette smoke and the specific tension of men who have been fighting for 5 months without stopping. General George S. Patton is at the table. Around him are some of the best military minds in the United States Army. And at the front of the room, about to say something that nobody in that room wants to hear, is a colonel named Oscar Koch. He is not famous. He has never been famous. He will go through the rest of his life after the war in a kind of deliberate, self-imposed obscurity that his biographer would later describe as one of the most unusual things he had ever encountered in a man who had done what this man had done. He will write a book about his wartime service and spend years unable to find a publisher for it because the book is, in a significant and structural way, about the fact that Oscar Koch did not want the book to be about Oscar Koch. He will die in 1970 in a small town in Illinois, a retired brigadier general who had served his country for 39 years, and the obituary in the local paper will be shorter than the ones written for local businessmen who had never left the state. But on December 9, 1944, standing at the front of that briefing room with his maps and his analysis and his conclusion that every other intelligence officer in the Allied command had looked at the same data and reached the wrong conclusion about, Oscar Koch is about to save the Battle of the Bulge before it starts. Type the word forgotten in the comments right now if you have never heard this man's name before today, because what he did in that room on that morning is the reason that approximately 20,000 American boys came home from the Ardennes who otherwise would not have. To understand the full weight of what Koch was about to say and why the room received it the way it did, you have to understand the specific intellectual atmosphere of Allied military intelligence in December of 1944. By that point in the war, the consensus among almost every Allied intelligence officer from the company level to Supreme Headquarters had crystallized into something so complete and so confident that it had stopped functioning as analysis and started functioning as belief. The belief was this: Germany was finished. Not losing. Finished. The Wehrmacht had been bled white across 5 years of war on multiple fronts. Their manpower was exhausted. Their fuel reserves were critically depleted. Their industrial capacity had been hammered by 2 years of Allied strategic bombing. The rational military calculus said that Germany did not have the resources to mount any kind of significant offensive operation. They were in retreat. They were defending. The war in the West was a matter of pushing forward, maintaining pressure, and waiting for the final collapse that everyone in the Allied command expected to happen within weeks or at most months. This was not an unreasonable conclusion. It was, based on the available evidence assessed through the standard intelligence frameworks, a defensible analytical position. The problem was that it was wrong. Oscar Koch was the only Allied intelligence officer at the operational level who had figured out that it was wrong, and who had the specific combination of professional courage and analytical rigor to say so to the man who most needed to hear it. According to the account published in Koch's own book G2, Intelligence for Patton, which finally found a publisher in the 1970s and which has since become a required text in United States Army intelligence training programs, Koch had been tracking a specific and deeply troubling pattern in the German order of battle since mid-November. While the consensus view focused on what the German army was doing with the forces it was deploying, Koch had become fixated on something different. He was focused on what it was doing with the forces it was not deploying. Specifically, he had identified 15 German divisions, including significant armored formations, that had been withdrawn from the front lines and that had effectively disappeared from the Allied picture of where German forces were and what they were doing. According to the standard intelligence assessment, these divisions were being held back because Germany was too depleted to deploy them. According to Koch's assessment, something else was happening entirely. He had been building his case for weeks. Through the specific combination of all-source intelligence analysis that he had developed and refined over years of working alongside Patton, pulling together aerial reconnaissance reports and prisoner interrogation records and signals intelligence and agent reports and the specific kind of pattern recognition that comes from looking at the same data from multiple angles simultaneously rather than relying on any single source, Koch had assembled a picture of a German force that was not dissolving. It was concentrating. In the Ardennes. In the densely forested, minimally defended, bitterly cold terrain between the American First Army's thinly stretched lines and the town of Bastogne. He stood up at the December 9th briefing and he said it out loud. He told Patton that the Third Army faced a potential threat to its northern flank. That the German forces being held in reserve were not being held because Germany lacked the strength to commit them. They were being held for a specific operation. That the Ardennes sector, which the Allied command had designated as a quiet area suitable for resting and refitting tired divisions, was the most likely target for that operation. and that the question was not whether the Germans were planning something in the north. The question was when. According to the accounts of officers present at the briefing, preserved in the Third Army operational records at the National Archives and referenced extensively in the detailed historical account of the Battle of the Bulge by historian Charles MacDonald in A Time for Trumpets, the room's reception of Koch's briefing was not enthusiastic. This is the specific and painful professional reality of being the person in any organization who stands up and says that the consensus is wrong. The consensus has momentum. The consensus has the weight of multiple intelligent people having looked at the same situation and reached the same conclusion. Disagreeing with the consensus requires not just a different conclusion but a willingness to absorb the social and professional friction of being the person in the room who thinks everyone else got it wrong. At Supreme Headquarters, the friction had been significant. SHAEF's own intelligence officer, Brigadier General Kenneth Strong, had raised similar concerns and had been sent to warn Omar Bradley directly. Bradley's response, preserved in the historical record, was 3 words. He said, "Let them come." He was not being reckless. He was expressing the consensus view with the specific confidence of a man who had looked at the German army's condition and genuinely could not imagine that what the intelligence was suggesting was actually possible. He had the same data Koch had. He had reached the opposite conclusion. Patton listened to Koch's briefing and did something that distinguished him from almost every other commander in the Allied theater. He did not dismiss it. He did not argue with it. He did not reach for the consensus view and use it to explain away what his intelligence officer was telling him. He stood up and said that they would be in a position to meet whatever happened. And then he told his chief of staff and his operations officer to begin immediately developing contingency plans for a major Third Army reorientation to the north. He gave those plans simple code names. St. Nickel. Thom. 3 options for different scales of response to a German offensive in the north, developed in detail over the following days so that when the order came, if it came, the Third Army would not be starting from zero. The plans would exist. The routes would be mapped. The supply requirements would be calculated. The unit movements would be sequenced. The Third Army would be, in the specific military sense of the word, ready. 7 days after Koch's December 9th briefing, at 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, 250,000 German soldiers with 1,000 tanks crashed through the Ardennes in the largest offensive operation of the entire Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Type the word 7 in the comments right now. 7 days. That is the margin by which Oscar Koch's analysis and Patton's decision to act on it separated the Third Army from being as completely surprised as every other American formation in the Ardennes. 7 days of contingency planning. 7 days of route reconnaissance and supply calculation and unit positioning. 7 days that transformed a military disaster into a military miracle. The morning of December 16th, before he even had confirmation of the full scale of what was happening in the north, Patton's intelligence officer Colonel Koch gave a final warning at the morning briefing. He told Patton that the Germans had gone into radio silence. And that in his assessment, radio silence of that specific character meant only one thing. They were about to attack. Koch was right. Again. With a specificity and a timing that, in the entire history of Allied intelligence operations in the Second World War, has no parallel. The emergency meeting that followed the German breakthrough was held on December 19th at Verdun, in a cold, bare room that Eisenhower's aide later described as reflecting the mood of the men in it. Eisenhower opened by saying that he only wanted to see cheerful faces at the table. He told his commanders that the German offensive, as terrible as it was, represented an opportunity rather than a disaster because Germany had committed its reserves into the open where the Allies could destroy them, rather than keeping them in defensive positions. Then he asked his generals how quickly they could counterattack. Patton said 48 hours. According to the accounts of every officer present at that meeting, preserved in multiple memoirs and after-action reports and in the detailed historical reconstruction provided by Carlo D'Este in his biography of Patton, the response to this statement was uniform and immediate. Nobody believed him. The British officers in the room, according to Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman's account, were the most openly skeptical. There was, Codman wrote, some laughter. The idea that an army of more than 100,000 men could disengage from one axis of advance, pivot 90 degrees in the middle of one of the worst winters in 50 years, and launch a major offensive operation in 48 hours was not something that the military experience of anyone in that room told them was operationally achievable. It had simply never been done. The planning timelines, the logistics requirements, the movement coordination alone should have made it impossible. What they did not know was that it was already happening. Before Patton left for Verdun, he had issued the code word that activated the contingency plans that Koch's warning had made possible. The 4th Armored Division was already moving north. The 80th and 26th Infantry Divisions were already redirecting. The supply columns were already being rerouted. The weather was brutal. The roads were ice and slush and the specific kind of frozen mud that turns military vehicles into stationary objects. The temperature was below 0 Fahrenheit across most of the operational area. And 133,000 vehicles and tanks were turning, in the dark and the cold, 90 degrees north toward the sound of the guns. They reached Bastogne on December 26. The 101st Airborne Division and the mixed force of American soldiers who had held the town through 10 days of siege, who had famously replied to the German demand for surrender with a single word that has gone down in military history, were relieved. The corridor was opened. The southern shoulder of the German offensive was broken. The Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive operation in the Western Theater, had been turned. It was, according to the military historians who have studied it in the decades since, the most remarkable army redeployment in the history of modern warfare. No force of that size had ever pivoted that fast in those conditions and attacked with that effectiveness on the other side of the turn. And almost nobody remembers the man who made it possible. When the histories were written, when the after-action reports were compiled and the memoirs were published and the official accounts of the Battle of the Bulge were assembled into the institutional memory of the United States Army, something happened to Oscar Koch's contribution that Koch himself had, in a way, made inevitable. He had spent his entire career operating on a specific professional principle that was admirable and self-defeating in equal measure. The principle was that the job of an intelligence officer was to serve his commander, not to serve his own reputation. That the credit for what intelligence made possible belonged to the commander who acted on it, not the officer who provided it. That the purpose of the analysis was the outcome and the outcome was Patton's. Koch believed this completely and genuinely. According to his biographer Robert Hayes, who spent years working with Koch on his memoirs and who published the account in Patton's Oracle, Koch was actively reluctant to claim credit for his role in the Bulge for fear that doing so would somehow diminish the reputation of Patton, for whom his professional loyalty and personal affection had never wavered. Eisenhower's memoir did not give Koch significant credit. Bradley's memoir did not give Koch significant credit. The popular accounts that established the public memory of the Battle of the Bulge did not give Koch significant credit. The 1970 film Patton, which won 8 Academy Awards and which shaped the public understanding of Patton and the Third Army for an entire generation, did not give Koch significant credit. He appeared briefly, in a few lines, as one of the staff officers who had been doing the work that Patton's genius had directed. Patton himself, the man who had called Koch the best intelligence officer in any American command, who had acted on Koch's warning when every other commander in the theater had dismissed the same evidence, who had been able to save 48 hours at Verdun because of 11 days of preparation that Koch's analysis had made possible, said in his own memoir that the success at Bastogne had come from a combination of excellent staff work and his own aggressive instinct for the offensive. Koch was mentioned, in passing, in the way that a man who gave his commander the foundation for the most famous military achievement of his career gets mentioned by a commander who understood, as Patton deeply did, that the story of the Third Army was the story of George Patton. Koch died on May 16, 1970 in Carbondale, Illinois. He was 73 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with the honors appropriate to a retired Brigadier General of the United States Army. His gravestone is there. His name is on it. And in 1993, 23 years after his death, the United States Army inducted Oscar W. Koch into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame, recognizing what the histories and the memoirs and the Hollywood film had not found adequate space to acknowledge. That the Battle of the Bulge had an intelligence officer who saw it coming. That the most famous military pivot in American history was made possible by a man in a briefing room in northeastern France who stood up 7 days before 250,000 German soldiers crossed the line of departure and told his commander what nobody else in the Allied command was willing to say. Patton said he had the best intelligence officer in any American command. He was right. He just did not say it quite loudly enough for history to hear it. Type the word heard in the comments if you think Oscar Koch deserved more than a passing mention in a memoir and a Hall of Fame induction 23 years after he died. Because the measure of what he gave is not a difficult calculation. It is the men who came home from Bastogne. The corridor that opened on December 26th. The army that turned 90 degrees in the dark and the cold in 48 hours because someone had spent 7 days getting it ready for exactly that turn. That is what Oscar Koch gave. His name is at Arlington. His book is on the required reading list at Army intelligence schools. His story is the one you just heard. And the next time you see the film or read the account of Patton saying 48 hours in that cold room at Verdun, The next time you see the dramatic 90-degree turn rendered in the shorthand of military history as the genius of a single man with ivory-handled revolvers and a polished helmet, remember that somewhere in a briefing room 7 days earlier, a colonel who did not want the credit was telling the man who would get all of it exactly what was coming and exactly how to be ready. For, if this story gave you something that the standard version does not, do one thing before you go. Hit the like button. Not for any algorithm. For the men at Bastogne. For the colonel in the briefing room. For the 23 years it took the institution he served his whole life to say his name out loud in the specific way that his contribution deserved. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going into the history that the official accounts summarize in a sentence and that deserves so much more. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these. And leave your honest thoughts in the comments because I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.